Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Marion. Thank you. It was funny, when I first wrote that model, I hadn't been exposed to Buddhism at all. And so I thought I had this wonderfully original idea. And then I showed it to a Buddhist friend of mine, and he said, "Oh, that's a cycle of birth and death. The Buddha wrote that 2,600 years ago." So I thought, well, does he have a copyright on it? So it's really, it's a Buddhist model. It's just that we keep relearning the lesson over and over again. And I also want to say that I am really very grateful to be here. Part of thinking about the issue of dying and grief in all of our lives is that, for me, it makes me fully aware of how precious every single moment is. And one of the things that's very precious about my life right now is having a gay Buddhist Sangha to practice with. I think of all the times I could have been born on this planet and all the forms I could have taken, that I am here and I'm with you all, and I think it's really wonderful. And along those lines, some of you may or may not be aware that GBF has gone through, its own kind of internal trials lately, some conflict, some resentment, some stress between some of the members. And, as I was thinking about that, I was thinking about the truth of suffering, of impermanence, and really letting that in, the truth of my dying, the truth of all of our dying. It occurs to me, where is the conflict? Where is the tension? Where is the drama in that? When we hold that up against the truth of impermanence, it kind of pales. It suddenly is not very important. And there's a kind of a letting go that happens. As I was thinking about the talk today, I was kind of half jokingly to myself imagining talking about what it would be like if, right at this moment, a big Safeway truck going down Page Street lost its brakes and came crashing into this meditation room and killed us all instantly. Where would our thoughts be? Would we be making our grocery list in our head, saying, well, I need eggs, I need bread, I need milk? Would we be thinking about that car that I really want to buy, or that promotion that I need? Where would our attention be? If today, when we're standing in line at McDonald's for lunch and some crazed postal worker comes in and sprays us with gunfire, where will our thoughts be? Where will my attention be? Will it be on how hungry I am? Will it be about how cute that guy is in line in front of me and how I wish he were my boyfriend? Will it be on, thinking the woman in line in front of me really doesn't need a double order of French fries? Where will my attention be at that particular moment? And we all kind of act as if, death and dying is something that's a long ways away, that we really have a lot of time to think about it. And when we get closer, that there'll be this kind of idyllic moment where we kind of sit and reflect on it. And yet, ironically, we think we're protecting ourselves by doing that. But for myself, I've discovered the very hard way that we really rob ourselves aliveness in the moment, really rob ourselves living fully if we don't directly address the issue of dying fully. So that's really what I want to talk about today. In these moments, as I've written here, we wake up to the fragility, the preciousness, and even the groundlessness of being. For a moment, for an hour, for a few weeks, or maybe for longer, when we have an experience that brings us in touch with the issue of dying, whether it's caring for a friend, a lover, ourselves who's dealing with an illness, or almost being sideswiped by a minibus on Market Street, we have a glimpse of this fragility, this preciousness, this groundlessness of our lives. And we hold on to it for a few moments, but then we lose it. After some period of time, this tender, throbbing openness to impermanence begins to fade. It's a little bit like a movie, I don't know if any of you have ever seen Burt Reynolds' The End, which is a very black comedy about this guy who has a terminal illness and tries all these different ways to deal with it. None of them work very well. And in one of the last scenes of the movie, he swims out towards the middle of the ocean, deciding that he's going to swim out until he can't swim anymore, and then he's just going to drown and die. And he gets way out in the ocean, the tides carrying him along, and then he suddenly realizes that he really wants to live. Suddenly gets this idea, and so he starts to struggle frantically to get back into shore. And the tide is too strong, and he realizes that he's really not going to make it. It's not going to happen. So he starts talking to God and says, okay, God, if you get me back to shore, I will give all my money to the poor. I'll go to church every Sunday, I'll be a real wonderful person. And then he starts to get a little closer to shore. He struggles and struggles, gets through the tide, and says, okay, well, I won't give all my money to the poor. I'll give half of it. And I'll go to church every other Sunday. And he gets a little closer. Then he says, well, God, you're the one who made me sick in the first place. So why should I go to church at all? And then the last part, he's climbing out of the sea onto the beach, perfectly safe, back to his kind of insulated way of being, which is our habitual way of being in the world. And when we have those moments of really opening to the truth of suffering and impermanence, they usually don't last for us, because it's such a tender, vulnerable place to be. In one of the GBF meetings recently, we were talking about Buddha nature, which is our true nature if we awaken to it, Buddhism says. And we came up with a bunch of words and descriptions, although it's really not in the words, it's in the experience. But some of the terms we came up with were impermanent and changing, devoid of self, beginningless and endless, ever new, ever present, non-dualistic, intimate but not attached, interconnected and interpenetrating, and non-discriminating. And most of us have had at least some kind of taste or intuition of this Buddha nature, of this sense of connectedness, whether we're practicing Buddhists or not. And it often happens in things like a moment of rare beauty in nature, where we're looking at an incredible mountain or a sunset, and just for a moment, there's no separation. The sense, all that exists is looking at that beautiful sight, and everything else kind of disappears, and yet that experience of beauty is everything. That is kind of a taste of Buddha nature. Most of us, if we're fortunate, have had the magical experience of intimacy with a lover or a friend, where you just feel completely understood and accepted, and you just kind of internally completely relax. That's a lot like Buddha nature. In surrender to the pleasure of sex and the moment of orgasm, that moment where the mind really stops, that moment where everything stops at the moment of orgasm, that's very much touches on no self, total connectedness, and what we call Buddha nature. It's a connectedness, a spaciousness, a totally letting go to nowness. But not only so-called positive experiences give us a glimpse of Buddha nature. There's also loss and heartbreak, death, our own or someone else's we love, the grief of loss, moments when the presence of loss has opened our heart, sitting with someone dying, for instance, when the sadness, hurt, and grief slowly melt our separateness. I know we've all had this experience. And we're able to feel tremendous love for the person who is dying, and a kind of compassion that really expands beyond that person. We have moments in grief when we realize how our almost unbearable sorrow really reveals a deep and abiding love, deeper than we even thought our capacity to love really was. In grieving together with a friend or a group of friends, this kind of shared loss exposes an abundance of love for each other, for all those reasons why those people annoyed us so much, suddenly pass away for a little while, and we just see them in their pain and in their ability to comfort us and our ability to comfort them. These experiences, like the pleasure experiences, can bring us closer to our true nature and the nature of existence, of Buddha nature. But one of the problems with these so-called good or pleasurable experiences is that in connecting with the sense of oneness, of non-separation, of letting go completely in the beauty of nature, intimacy with a lover, the moment of orgasm, is that it invariably leads to grasping, trying to hold on to that experience. Buddhists would say we become deluded in that we think that that expansion, that wave of joy, is in that experience. And so we try to reach for that experience. So we get caught into the squirrel cage of seeking more and more of that. I need more intimacy, just the right lover, just the right sexual experience. Desperately seeking peak experiences in something external to ourselves. And I know I certainly have had this experience. If I could get out in nature and just see as beautiful a sunset as I saw in Maui that one night, and then so we go looking for that, but nothing ever quite measures up to that. Or if I could just find the right lover or a better lover who gives me what I really need and the connectedness I really long for. Or one that's popular in this community, more sex, hotter, more kinkier with the perfect guy. That's going to somehow give us that sense of letting go completely, sense of oneness that we're really all looking for. So we mistakenly think that experience of opening, of expansion, release, and letting go is in these pleasurable experiences. And in seeking them over and over, we get disappointed. We become grasping with diminishing returns. One of my best friends from a long time ago was a sex addict, and he would come home, 3 or 4 in the morning, shaking his head, saying, a dime's worth of work, or no, it was the opposite. He said, $1 worth of work for a dime's worth of pleasure. That was his way of looking at it. And you can see that, when you're out and about, people seem to be working so hard. If I run out in a club, it's like, isn't this supposed to be fun? People, it's like, this is really hard work to try to get that experience. And the interesting thing about death and dying, loss and grief, is that while it can bring us a glimpse of our true nature, it generally does not lead to grasping. I don't know about you, but I've never said to myself, I just had a devastating loss that broke me open emotionally, and I'd really like to have one of those again soon. We don't generally seek that out. We have an aversion to that. We try to get away from that. So we have an experience of brokenness, of overwhelming sorrow that reveals how deeply we love, and how that's the only thing that really matters. We feel the impermanence of life as a friend or a lover that we hold so dear slips away from us, and that exquisite preciousness of every moment with that person. In other words, we begin to have a taste of Buddha nature. But in this situation, it doesn't taste good, it tastes awful. Sort of on the experience like this is on the list of worst things that can happen to any of us. And this is why grief and loss and opening to it has been such a good teacher for me. It has not been a teaching that I like, but it finds me, however I might try to avoid it, as it finds us all sooner or later. For me, it's painful, overwhelming, and brings me up against the truth of suffering and impermanence. Usually, I think to myself, isn't there an easier way to do this? But for me, the experience of loss and loss over and over again bring me, or drag me kicking and screaming, more likely, to the path of awakening. And so this is an opportunity that we all have. I would not be a Buddhist if the loss had not hit my life the way that it had. And if I could choose to go back and not have that loss have happened, I would. But I also think that something would be lost, even though something would be gained. I'm really not different, I know, than anyone else in this room. We've all had kind of overwhelming losses. And we've all had a teaching on impermanent suffering and death in the last years that has been accelerated for us. For me, this has caused a crisis of emotional overload, of meaninglessness and futility that has led me to ask the question, what is real? What matters? How can I possibly live a normal life when everything I was taught is important? My career, my physique, my money seem so insignificant in the face of the enormity of loss and love. A lot of you have heard the story of Krisha Gotami, who was a woman who had the good fortune to live at the time of the Buddha 2,600 years ago. And when she was still a young woman, her first child her son, who she loved more than anything else in the world, fell sick and died. And when this happened, Krisha Gotami went kind of crazy with grief and carried the body of her little boy through the streets, asking anyone she knew for a cure that would bring her son back to life. And most people laughed at her. Some people thought she was crazy. But most people just kind of ignored her until she finally came to a wise man who told her that the only one who can help you is the Buddha. So she found out that the Buddha was speaking outside of the town, and she took the body of her child to the Buddha, laid him at her feet, and said that a wise man told me that only you can help me to bring my child back to life. And so the Buddha told her the only way to heal your affliction is to go to the town and fetch a mustard seed from a house in which there has not been any loss. And so Krisha Gotami felt elated because she thought she was going to get her son back. So she went back to the town and went to the first house she saw, knocked on the door, and when the people opened the door, said, the Buddha sent me and told me to fetch a mustard seed from a home in which there has not been any death. And people looked at her and smiled sadly and said, we can't help you. There's many people who have died here. And so she shrugged her shoulders and she went to the next house and knocked on their door and explained the same thing, saying, I need a mustard seed from a house where there has not been any death or dying. And they shook their head and said, I'm sorry, many people in our family have died here. We can't give you the mustard seed you need. And so she went from house to house, so on throughout the town, looking for a home in which there had not been a death. And then night began to fall, and she'd gone through almost all the city and really kind of despaired and sat probably at the edge of the city by herself, kind of staring out at the stars as they were coming out. And then suddenly it kind of struck her what the Buddha was trying to teach her. And so she went back to find the Buddha, and she knelt at his feet, and she said, I realized the lesson you were trying to teach me. In my sorrow, I thought I was the only one who had really suffered a loss this devastating. And I've discovered now that suffering is a condition that we all share. And then the Buddha asked, well, then why have you come back? And she said, to teach me what is real, to teach me, if anything at all, lasts beyond death, and to teach me the truth of impermanence and suffering. And so Krisha Gotami followed the Buddha for the rest of her life. And it said near the end of that life, she realized enlightenment. And when I first heard this story, it really spoke to me because I think it's really kind of all our stories. It's amazing how, with loss being the most universal of all human experiences, that each of us can feel so uniquely wronged, so ripped off by the universe, so forsaken. And that really creates a kind of a closing, a kind of a tightness around the experience of suffering and loss that really doesn't allow it to deepen our spiritual practice. It's amazing that devastating loss can come as such a shock, such a personal affront, and give us each a sense of being uniquely wronged. It's interesting how bewildered, turned upside down, we are to the truths of suffering, of dying, of impermanence. And in the midst of that, we try desperately to keep it together, to keep our dignity and our poise. But something inside us breaks. We are really lost. We're really kind of emotionally all over the map. And when I think about that, I think of the famous Mary Tyler Moore episode about the death of Chuckles the Clown. I don't know if any of you remember that. But it's great because Mary's trying so hard to do the right thing. She's really touched by the death of her friend Chuckles. And poor Chuckles dies because he's dressed up in a giant peanut costume in this kind of parade, and there's a nearsighted elephant behind him who mistakes him for a peanut and crushes him to death. This is, the front page news, and all the rest of the news staff are just kind of tittering and laughing. Chuckles the Clown, look how he died, can you believe it? And Mary is all indignant. She says, how can you do this? This guy was our friend. How dare you laugh at his death? And everyone else just can't help it because it's just so funny. But, she's trying to do the right thing, trying to have that dignity and poise. And then it gets all the way up to the memorial service, and they're all there. And the minister begins the eulogy, talking about who Chuckles the Clown really was and the way he brought joy to everyone's heart and all the characters he played. He dressed up in a banana outfit for the produce market. He dressed up like a bunny at Easter and brought joy to so many people. And this suddenly strikes Mary as incredibly funny. So in the middle of this most serious of events, this eulogy, she starts to burst out laughing. She absolutely cannot control herself. And the minister's trying to go on and on and on, and she's just, she's holding her sides. She's trying to control herself from laughing, and she really can't help herself. So finally the minister says, stand up, young lady. It's okay for you to laugh. It's wonderful. Chuckles brought joy to everyone's life. Go ahead, laugh. He would be happy looking down from wherever he is, knowing that you were laughing. And as soon as that penetrates her, she immediately begins to sob. So it's a story of, how all of us really try to keep it together around grief, when grief is really kind of breaking us open. And we really need to invite ourselves to allow it to break us. I knew in this talk I had to include some of the Zen wisdom of the Mary Tyler Moore Show, since it was a gay talk. So Buddhism for me is an ongoing practice of approaching this stumbling bewilderment with compassion instead of running from it or repressing it. I'm slowly learning, very slowly, to be with it as I go through it. One Zen teacher says chaos, whether internal or external chaos, should always be viewed as extremely good news. And my answer to that is, well, if chaos is the good news, I don't think I want the bad news. But it's really true that there's a kind of a chaos, a kind of an upheaval emotionally that happens to us in the affront that grief and loss develops, that is an opening to practice. So how does this chaos, this grief and loss, confusion, become a path to awakening? My first glimpse of Buddha nature that I recall is when I was about 4 or 5 years old. I was sitting in my parents' backyard, and this is a wonderful memory in a childhood with not a lot of wonderful memories, but I was sitting back there, and I just felt this incredible connectedness to everything and everyone. I was sitting in the lawn. It was a nice summer day. I remember insects kind of buzzing around me and feeling a real sense of not being separate from anything around me. It was less of a memory in my mind and kind of a full body experience of really the interconnectedness and interpenetrating nature of Buddha nature. I know a lot of people have glimpses from childhood of this kind of wave of joy, this kind of euphoria, this kind of connectedness. But this stands in sharp contrast to our habitual way of living, at least my habitual way of living, which is to struggle to hold on to some sense of safety or protection or control in my life. Those Buddhists who talk a lot about the concept of ego are really talking about our search and our struggle for safety, for control, for protection. And that many at least of my own behaviors are really manipulations and strategies to protect myself, to remain in control, to maintain some kind of safety. And this was really blown out of the water by a friend of mine, Dan, who was a very beautiful inside and outside man who had AIDS. And he told me once a few years ago that he could handle almost anything except the idea of blindness or the idea of paralysis, of becoming a vegetable and not being able to move or communicate or connect. And unfortunately, about 2 years later, he became sick with an opportunistic infection, which left him in a position where he was blind and he couldn't move and he couldn't talk. And I went to visit him at his home and really just sat with him holding his hand. His face was sort of frozen and mask-like because he really couldn't make any kind of expression or talk, but his eyes were really alive and kind of looking into my eyes and kind of beseeching. And I just sat there holding his hands and looking into his eyes. And in that moment, something inside of me broke. It was like all my ideas about being able to help Dan in some way, of being able to help anything in any way, suddenly seemed totally futile, totally worthless. I felt completely helpless. All my sense of power, safety, and protection and being in control kind of shattered. And tears began to roll down Dan's face, and they also began to roll down my face. And we just sat there for the longest time. And when I left him that day, just a few days before he died, I felt very, very hollow and empty. But interestingly enough, I had this awareness that I had no control over anything, that I was completely powerless, that I was helpless, that there was no safety, no protection. And yet I wasn't in a panic about that at all. Instead, I felt very peaceful and very silent, very hollow. But there was no conversation going on in my head. I felt completely at peace in a strange sort of way. Since that event, the mantra of safety, protection, and control, my kind of habitual pattern of living in my life, has come back. But I don't give it as much power anymore. I say to myself that I don't worship at its altar anymore. And I really, I think of Dan a lot and the gift that he gave me in his life and also in his dying to teach me about letting go. Because in that awareness, I realized that I've already lost the battle and the war for survival. And when I realized that, I just really need to remind myself to let go. When I do that, I notice what a cramped, dark closet the strategies for manipulation, safety, protection, and control can be. And then when I realize that, there's a real freedom. And just for the last few minutes of my talk then, I want to talk about the circular model that I came up with, because the experience that I'm talking about here is something that I know everybody can connect with, but I also think that it's a hard thing for us to connect with when we have ongoing losses, what I call multiple loss or global loss, where we get hit with loss after loss after loss. In those kinds of situations, it's very hard to stay open. It's very, very hard not to shut down and tighten up. And that's why I came up with the circular loss model, is because for me, I realized I needed a way to relate to the ongoing experience of grief, of denial, of anger, of fear, of depression, in such a way that I could remain more open, that I didn't have to tighten up about it. And as in remaining more open, there's a lot of freedom in that, and a lot of aliveness and vitality that I otherwise would be missing. In one of the GBF sittings, I was talking about this concept of grief and the path to awakening, and one of the other guys raised his hands and said, "Excuse me, I'm having trouble relating to this. You know, I've had lots of losses, and I'm just lonely and miserable. You know, I haven't seen any great light." We joked about it a little, that the chorus line of Bodhisattvas has not appeared to him, singing "Everything's Coming Up Rigpa." That has not happened yet. You know, he's just really unhappy. He's just really miserable and just very lonely. And so the circular model of loss, I think, really definitely speaks to that, addresses that. And I'll go through that very quickly and then wrap up. First of all, when dealing with global loss, we're dealing with trauma, which is an emotional experience that's so overwhelming that it produces in us a degree of terror and fear that causes us to shut down in a lasting way. And as part of that shutting down, there's kind of a pendulum swing that happens emotionally for us that goes back and forth between numbing and flooding, from being numb and not feeling anything to flooding, where we feel overwhelmed with feelings and very often intrusive images of the loss. What happens with cumulative loss is that we get chronically stuck in the numbing stage. So we don't really get a chance to clear it out and become really alive again. The shutting down, tightening around loss stage continues just because the losses go on and on and on. And a real answer to this question, this issue, is Buddhism and Buddhist practice. Because in meditation practice, there's a kind of a letting go that happens. I know that when I first started meditating, I sort of thought that meditation was going to be like this vacation from irritation. You know, I was just going to sit down and kind of tune into the Zen radio station in my head and just have it be just quiet and peaceful. But as I discovered, and as I continue to discover, as my practice is deepening, I have to look at all sorts of feelings and images and experiences that I have really repressed, that is part of my numbing to life. And that's not always pleasant. I went through a stage where I felt an enormous amount of anger, and I would sit in practice and just rage and rage and rage. And then I kind of broke through that and went into a period in my practice where I just cried all the time. You know, I did loving kindness meditation, and I would just cry and cry. And I would come at my partner, who's here today. I don't know where he's sitting, where Doug is, but he's not. He's hiding. He's just learning about meditation. I walk out of my sitting, with my eyes all puffy, looking absolutely drained. And he says, "Explain to me once again what you're getting from this. How is this helping you relieve stress?" It's really funny. But it is really a part of that letting go and coming alive again. And then, I'm talking very briefly about the stages of loss and different ways to relate to them. I have the circular model of loss and these different stages at different points in the circle that aren't in any particular order, and you bounce back and forth between all of them. One of them is denial, which really has to do with this kind of numbing, this kind of shutting down, this kind of idea that we only have two choices, numbness or despair, when practice really offers us another choice, which is really opening up to our experience. I talk about anxiety or fear. And in anxiety, there's what I call internalizing fear, which is really kind of clamping around the fear and the pain, and very often comes up in our community in hypochondriasis and other kinds of symptoms. And then externalizing fear, which is really giving ourselves permission to feel afraid, to realize that that's really okay, to acknowledge our basic fears of separation from loved ones, fears of not being in control, fears of pain, fears of loss, and that if we can hold those fears in what Jack Kornfield calls an ocean of loving kindness, then we find that instead of driving us crazy, that actually they soften, and our experience with them changes, and our capacity to really be alive in the moment has increased. With anger, I think internalized anger is guilt and shame. If bad things happen to me, it must be because I'm a bad person or I've done something bad. I think that's something that we as gay men are especially vulnerable to. We're really the shame and guilt carriers for this society, so it's constantly being focused on us. And a healthy way to deal with anger is what I jokingly refer to as righteous indignation, which is kind of acknowledging our own innocence and allowing ourselves to be angry and directing that anger. And I know that anger is not necessarily a very Buddhist concept, but I think we really need to acknowledge the difference between the Western personality and the Eastern personality here, that anger plays a very important role for us. Jack Kornfield talks about spiritual people who don't deal with their anger as spayed and neutered people, because there's this kind of artificial niceness. And that instead, if we acknowledge our anger and penetrate it, what we find is that moving towards it with loving compassion, that we go through it and there's usually something else on the other side, like fear or shame or grief, some other feeling that was just too vulnerable to acknowledge that we had to protect. So welcoming anger is part of that process. Then depression. There's depression that a lot of us deal with, which is isolating and feeling despair, withdrawing from relationships, psychological fatigue. Our sense of our cherished life assumptions crumble under the onslaught of loss. And that's another effect of trauma and loss, which is our sense of self-worth, our sense of meaning in the world, and our sense of benevolence. Those kind of values sort of crumble. And in depression, very often what's missing is the courage and the energy to allow ourselves to be broken. And especially with global loss, I think people definitely get to a point where they're really too exhausted and they've already been broken open by loss so many times that they really can't do it anymore. And in those cases, the key is really just to get support and to really nurture yourself and to build your strength and work your practice to the point where you can really let go. Because the wonderful thing about Dharma is it's a container that's big enough to handle your despair and your loss. And I'm not quite sure how that works. It's kind of a magical process. But you think, if I really move into this, I'm going to start crying. I'm never going to stop. And what happens instead is that you move through it and move into it, and you come out someplace different, someplace softer and more open, and still very tender, but also very alive and able to really enjoy life. If you can find the strength or build the strength to allow yourself to be broken and let go, what happens is what I call in my cycle adaptation. And the healthy form of adaptation is recommitment or renewal or being awake in a Buddhist context. And being awake just means having the energy to be fully present in the moment and really let go. What I've written here is that it's a rethinking of assumptions that accepts the reality of loss and still allows for self-worth and meaning. There's a shift from trying not to die to living fully, a shift from hiding and escaping or waiting for it to be over to recommitting and participating in living, whatever happens. It's a shift from grieving and letting go of our lives as we expected them to be, to participate in the present. And there's kind of a renewal of vitality and a capacity for enjoyment. And like I say, there's a real psychological fatigue in our community that creates an unhealthier or more stressful form of adaptation, which I call disengagement, which we close down around our feelings, where we rally our energy to avoid or escape from the futility or fatality we feel, where we're unable to open up and trust and be intimate. Something I hear a lot from guys that I work with is that they're functioning okay, but the humor and playfulness in their life, their sense of joie de vivre and spontaneity is gone or is hard to find. Their sense of purpose and meaning is difficult for them to determine, why am I here, what am I doing here? And their capacity to reconnect with intimacy and relationships is limited. They're very ambivalent about reinvesting. And Buddhism offers a really worthwhile way for us to move into that. And just to close today, I want to read a couple quotes from Stephen Levine. One has to do with the concept of letting go and allowing ourselves to be broken. And again, that fear that if we do that, that all we'll find is kind of endless futility and despair, and that indeed that's not the case. What he's written here is, once someone asked a well-known Thai meditation master, in this world where everything changes, where nothing remains the same, where loss and grief are inherent in our very coming into existence, how can there be any happiness? How can we find security when we see that we can't count on anything being any way we want it to be? The teacher, looking compassionately at this fellow, held up a drinking glass which had been given to him earlier in the morning, and he said, "You see this goblet? For me, this glass is already broken. I enjoy it. I drink out of it. It holds my water admirably, sometimes even reflecting the sun in beautiful patterns. If I should tap it, it has a lovely ring. But when I put this glass on a shelf, and the wind knocks it over, or my elbow brushes it off the table and it falls to the ground and shatters, I say, of course. When I understand that this glass is already broken, every moment with it is precious. Every moment is just as it is, and nothing needs to be otherwise." So there's the container for us to hold the brokenness. And instead of denying us life, it really gives us life. The very last little quote, which is one of my favorite stories, is about a contemporary Zen master, Roshi Taji. And I think it really speaks to how accepting the absolute vulnerability of the truth of suffering and impermanence gives us a sense of aliveness. What one Zen teacher talks about, being willing to die and die continually in every moment. And it goes, a contemporary Zen master, Roshi Taji, approached death with his senior disciples assembled at his bedside. One of them, remembering the Roshi was fond of a certain kind of cake, had spent half a day searching the pastry shops of Tokyo for this confection, which he now presented to Roshi Taji. With a wan smile, the dying Roshi accepted a piece of cake and slowly began munching it. As the Roshi grew weaker, his disciples leaned close and inquired whether he had any final words. They were waiting for, these deep words of spiritual wisdom that they would be able to carry on, his final words. And the Roshi said yes. The disciples leaned forward eagerly. Please tell us. And he looked up at them sweetly and said, my, but this cake is delicious. And then he died.
We're out of time, actually. We don't really have time for questions and comments and stuff. Maybe, what? A few minutes? Want to do a few minutes? Yeah, I guess.
We can run over.
Okay.
I don't have a question, just a comment I would make. It's not going to ripple.
Kind of a comment as well, which is that in the experience I had where my 6 close friends got ill and proceeded to die, I spent 3 years with them. That process took, even though I thought I'd been prepared for that, because I spent years working with people who were dealing with these same issues, this experience for me was different. And I completely broke down and broke apart, which I was unprepared for. And the piece that came, and I really did things like roll around on the floor all by myself. I just couldn't help myself. What happened? And then eventually I rolled around with people watching me. But what I was later able to understand a little bit is that what, on some deep level, what happened to me was my sense of connectedness in the world had broken down. And that what was so frightening for me and made the situation really unparalleled was that I had always counted on that sense of it had always been part of me. And so I really taken it for granted. It's like breathing, I never even noticed it was there. So when it got broken down suddenly, I was in a world I did not recognize. And that experience of not recognizing anything, very bizarrely, over a period of time, helped create another kind of way of connecting in the world. It wasn't something I could do consciously or rationally, or in any other form. I mean, I could get help. I got lots of help. Very loving help. But that was merely a container to help me bridge from one place to another place. But it was not, even now, it's not available to my conscious mind. And this was before I began sitting, so I didn't have that resource. And in fact, it was after that I began to sit. I mean, that was all that I could do. And that was the other side of that bridge. Of course, it was completely unseeable. I couldn't see where I was going with my eyes, or even with my heart. I could not see. And to accept that I could not see, and to live with the not seeing, was what that was.
Yes. Without necessarily knowing what's going to be on the other side.
Absolutely.
You might just not see and not feel connection forever.
Nothing.
And,
it was deep and true blindness. And I think, in a certain way, what you said about your friend is my experience, not only about my life, but about life as I understand it, is that the things that are deeply embedded in me as my deepest fears are what, of course, life inevitably holds for me.
Yes, that's really true. One of the other GBF members told me about a dream he had, or actually part of his meditation practice, which was wonderful, where for a few weeks he had this hovering, kind of terrible, scary energy, or painful energy close to him, and then finally, in the meditation, he thought it was some demon or whatever, or some ghost, and he reached out and embraced it and became the Buddha. And it's like that, but you really don't know. I mean, you really don't know.
First of all, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Secondly, I too have been surprised by things that I thought I was prepared for which I was not. And there were articles early on about people who were negative, feeling guilty about not being positive. And I have lived all of my life in a not very well body. And to begin to lose my friends who are healthy and have great vitality, through natural causes, because I'm now in my 60s, it was something I was totally unprepared for, completely unprepared for. And I've just been overwhelmed by the amount of grief that has come out of that. And I'm just beginning to have the feeling that it's not my fault, and that I don't have to spend the rest of my life in empty hallways, that I can, in fact, open my doors, and that there is still something out there. And the something out there is most often here.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.